Ladies and gentlemen, once again, you're all very welcome. Please do take your seats. So you're very welcome to participate in the Field Chamber this evening as an association with DU History. We're very happy to be working with them on this debate. And the motion for the House this evening is this House would have signed the treaty. So I'm now going to call on our 30 seats to Anna Group to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
The minutes were read and signed without objection. So that was the exec debate, which was run and organised entirely by Fulbrighters, and for which I think they deserve a massive congratulations and a round of applause. In which almost every speaker began their speech with some kind of self-depreciating remark about their imagined lack of confidence, which was ironic because then they then proceeded to give a speech to a room of about 200 people. And did so really well, so probably just a bunch of hypocrites. A good example of this was Manus Dennison. Manus, are you here? Do you want to stop? So this is Manus, everyone. Manus spoke at length about how as a teenager he was pretty much a big lonely loser, which took on some heartstrings and got him some sympathy, and more importantly, got him some really, really funny photos on his Facebook page. However, it very quickly became apparent that Manus is the personification of the patriarchy, at which point everybody in the room reverted to resenting his white defense lifestyle. But for me, the highlight of the evening was the arrival of Daniel Uptown Strunk, the man that Rand Paul wishes he could be. Daniel gave a stirring defense of individual liberty and property rights in his speech, which was great, but the debate was about Tinder. For those of you who don't know, he is actually supremely qualified for the debate, describing himself as somewhat of an expert on the hookup culture. He's also known to dispense sage advice to his students. Just this week, he advised our very own Conan Quinn to not be a pigeon. His explanation for this cryptic comment was as follows: pigeons shit on everything. Don't be a pigeon. You have to balance criticism and praise. Don't shit on everybody. Don't be a pigeon. There being no further business, the meeting.
Okay, so we have some guests with us this evening. So on proposition, we have Miles Dungan, who is an expert on 19th century Irish history, author and broadcaster. And speaking in opposition of the motion, we have Irish Answer, a meaningful politician and historian. And a very young Professor Ewan Halpin, Professor of Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College. Special guest speaker with us this evening, Darren Keenan, speaking on proposition of the motion, who was the best speaker at the Phil Speaks competitive debating weekend, a debating competition that Phil runs for senior cycle secondary school students. And just a few quick standing orders. So speeches are a maximum of 7 minutes in length for student speakers and 10 minutes in length for guest speakers. In terms of protected time and points of information, after the first minute of each speech, there will be a bell. After this point, members of the floor and speakers in the debate are free to offer points of information to the speaker. And we'd ask you to keep it a maximum of 10 to 15 seconds in length, and if you refuse to please sit down. Before the last minute of the speech, there will be another bell. And after this point, no more points of information can be offered. And at the final minute, there will be a double bell, which means that the speaker should be able to wrap up their speech. So audience participation is encouraged, so if you agree with what a speaker is saying, please feel free to say "you here," and if you disagree with what a speaker is saying, please feel free to say "shame." I'd also encourage you to fill out the oratory returns, which are placed on your chairs, and this goes towards the gold medal for oratory at the end of the year, which is awarded to the speaker who is the best speech in this session. These are to be handed to our two pro-seps, Owen and Matthew, at the door on your right out. So without further ado, we shall start the debate. So in opening opposition, I call on Amy Sullivan. She is a junior English and history. So you can choose to keep these neighbours' rights and accept no points of information from the floor, or you can choose to waive them, accept points of information, and get rapturous round of applause. What you choose to do.
Ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amy and I'm really proud to stand here and say that this House would have signed the treaty. I'm going to be dividing my speech into 3 main sections, giving some background on why the treaty and how the treaty negotiations came about. Then I'm going to be discussing the 3 main points of contention in the treaty, and lastly I'm going to be discussing what would have happened if the treaty had not been signed. So I'm going to jump straight in. So to give this debate some context, what were the treaty negotiations? So these came about as a result of the Irish War of Independence, which raged from 1919 to 1921. And it was essentially a conflict of guerrilla warfare. To combat this, Lloyd George sent in, who was Prime Minister, sent in the Black and Tans, which were war veterans, World War One. And like I think I need hardly tell you that the Black and Tans committed some terrible atrocities throughout Ireland and were so feared and hated in their day that they live on Ireland to this day. They conducted reprisal attacks on civilians. They burnt the towns of Balbriggan and Tuam to the ground, Bloody Sunday and Croke Park, and they also almost burnt Cork City down completely to the ground. And then the IRA and the side were also not innocent, also committing murders of civilians. So by 1921, hundreds were dead, and the IRA was running out of ammunition and running out of fighters. So truce was negotiated in Lloyd George and by Lyndon de Valera to Britain to negotiate a treaty. So I think it's important to remember that like Ireland did not win this war of independence, and they did not like bring the British Empire to their knees. It was like public opinion in Britain turned against the Black and Tans because of the atrocities they committed. So Britain was still stronger and was not going to give up Ireland without a fight because they did not want to encourage other independence movements in other parts of the empire. So now I'm talking about the 3 points of contention in negotiations. And these are the unity of Ireland, the degree of independence that Ireland would have, and what the Irish relationship would be with the British Empire. And all 3 points help to show why we would have signed the treaty. So first of all, the unity of Ireland. So there was like 2 very extreme sides. Obviously, the Republicans wanted a united Ireland with all counties included. The Republicans wanted to unite Ireland, and then the Unionists did not want this to happen at all. But during the War of Independence, the Government of Ireland Act had been passed, which created 2 like separate autonomous Irish political unions. And by the time the treaty was negotiated, Northern Ireland was like government was already up and running. So it was impossible to ensure like the unity of Ireland because partition was a reality, and partition was a reality you couldn't get rid of. So the real question of the time was what would happen to areas and counties like Fermanagh and Tyrone who had a Catholic majority. Now the reason I would have signed this treaty was like obviously these became an issue because the border commission was supposed to sort this out and like make sure people who wanted to be in the south were in the south, but obviously that didn't work. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that the treaty was like a flawless document because it wasn't, because every document has flaws. But I think you have to realize that like people genuinely believed the border commission was going to work, and people genuinely hoped and thought that within like a year or 2 everyone who wanted to be in the Republic was going to be in the Republic, and this is why we would have signed the treaty, because even though it didn't fix all the problems, it did attend to, and it did stop the Civil War, which was causing so much devastation. Secondly, like the degree of independence that the treaty afforded Ireland. So Ireland, the treaty like offered Ireland way more independence than had ever been offered in any of the Home Rule bills or the Government of Ireland. Ireland basically had full autonomy in so much as that it was had complete control over its own police and army and British troops, which had complete control over fiscal policy, tariffs and customs, who they traded with, etc. So they basically had full autonomy, which was much, much closer to a republic than had ever been offered Ireland before. And I don't see why you would turn this down, because it was very clear that the British were going to keep a hold in Ireland. They had decided that from the start. It was not going to become a republic. It was going to stay with links to the empire. So with this massive amount of independence that has been offered, which was obviously really good for the Irish people, because then they could decide who they traded with, they could decide their own policies. And that was really important. So they even got to like pick the name of the state. That was how much freedom they were given to the Irish Free State from the Irish Fair State. So this is why we signed the treaty. Also, and then on to the last point of contention, which was the relationship to the empire. Ireland Republicans had like a big problem with the treaty because Ireland was not a complete independent republic. It was still linked to the British Empire. The king had to be accepted as the nominal head of state, and an oath of allegiance had to be said to the crown. And so like it was on this basis that a lot of Republicans and a lot of people still opposed it, because they said like, you know, you're giving in, you're compromising, and people have died for this republic. And first off, I think like by going to have a treaty, you're going to understand that like there's going to be some compromise involved because there's no conditions set. But secondly, I think like this was more lip service than anything else. Like Collins was literally told by Lord George, got so exasperated by the Irish's like avoidance of the issue, that he could word the oath in any way he liked, so long as it conveyed what they wanted to convey. So Like, this was the one thing that the British weren't going to back down on. It was the one thing they wanted to keep Ireland within the Commonwealth, but they were giving them so much independence in doing so. They were being so liberal with the links that they would have formed with the Empire, that they were literally allowed to word the oath in whatever way was most pleasing to the Irish people, so long as it recognised the King as nominal head of state. Which, as I said in my other point, is so much more than the Irish had ever had. A great opportunity, and why we should have signed the treaty. So lastly, I want to talk about what would happen if the treaty had not been signed and what the British were going to do if the treaty had not been signed. So I think what the people of Ireland, on the ground, and people who trying to live their everyday lives, they just wanted peace. They wanted this long, drawn out war to be over. They wanted their family and friends to come home from the intern camps that they'd kept them up and down in Wales. People wanted the black and tans to leave so they can get on with their own life. And ordinary people on the ground, it didn't really make that much of a difference whether or not people were paying lip service to the British Empire or whether or not they're a full functioning republic. It's more of an ideological struggle than one that actually affects people's everyday lives. And if we had not signed the treaty, war, immediate and terrible, and that's a quote, was threatened. So there would be more atrocities, more arrests, and black and tans would have come back. It would have been absolutely terrible for the people who were still living in Ireland, because Michael Collins admitted himself, in a couple more weeks, the IRA would have run out of men, run out of arms. They weren't in a position to take on the full might of the British Empire's army against essentially farmers. So I think in the face of this terrible war, which wouldn't happen if they hadn't signed the treaty, and in the massive advantages they gained in the three-point convention, I'd be very proud to sign the treaty. Thank you.
Opposition, Mr. Ian Kemp. So you, as you are also waiting speaker, you too are afforded ladies' rights. So do you choose to keep these ladies' rights, or do you choose to waive them?
I'll waive them. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom has had but one definition. It has not meant a limited freedom, a freedom conditioned by the interests of another nation, a freedom compatible with the suzerain authority of a foreign parliament, but absolute freedom. The sovereign control of Irish destinies. It has not meant the freedom of a class, but the freedom of a people. It has not meant the freedom of a geographical fragment of Ireland, but the freedom of all Ireland, of every sod of Ireland. So wrote Patrick Pearse 6 years before Lloyd George and Griffith signed the treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, I aim to show how acceptance of the treaty was a fundamental betrayal to the cause of Irish freedom, and how the treaty illegitimately challenged an already established democratic republic. Firstly, how did the treaty betray the cause of Irish freedom? A cause dating not from 1916 or even 1798, but the separatist cause dating from the first moment of resistance to the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169. When we speak of a country's freedom, we do not speak of limited national sovereignty, subject to the wishes of another country, individual, corporation, or some other entity. There is no point in having some freedom in theory, like the freedom to have your own coins or the freedom to have your own flag, if all you do with it is to rule your country as an oppressor would rule you, to rule on behalf of the oppressor. Self-oppression as a supposedly free state is not freedom.
Information?
No, thank you. The fundamental right of any people is the right to control their own affairs, all their affairs, for the people to have unfettered control of their destinies. In 1916, the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland was declared sovereign and indefeasible. National independence was demanded, and a republic uniting orange and green was proclaimed. In 1921, a document was signed which tried to put a lid on the unconquerable demand for Irish freedom in the deceitful guise of a sham freedom, a so-called freedom to achieve freedom. No man has the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, thus far thou shalt go, and no further, as Parnell remarked. No, thank you. In December 1921, 12 men in Downing Street tried to fix the boundary to the march of this nation in more ways than one. Over the course of 18 articles, Ireland was put in her place. confined to the shackles of the British Empire under their crown, as well as being cut in two in a bid to foster sectarian division and to smash Tone's concept of Protestant, Catholic and Dissenter united as Irish women and Irish men. The treaty spelt out in no uncertain terms that Ireland was and is a second-rate nation. We reject such an assertion. We reject the actions of any country to conquer, colonise or subjugate others, or force their terms by threatening war and terror, as Lloyd George did. More importantly, we reject the actions of those who sell out their nation and the people's right to be free, be they Quisling in Norway, Pétain in France, or Free Staters in Ireland. I'll take a point first. Yeah.
So you talked about freedom and how we all wanted to unite Ireland, but what about the massive amount of people in the north who didn't want to be part of that?
Okay, I'll continue to address that once we go. In 1918, the Irish people voted for national independence as a unit, all of the Irish people. Tired of not being their own masters, tired of empty promises of home rule and the Gombean attitudes of the stoop down low home rule party, tired of burying their loved ones who died in imperialist uniforms seeking crumbs from the table of empire. They embraced the Republican call and voted not to redefine the connection with England, but to break it. Dáil Éireann was established, an Irish government formed, independence made tangible, and the Republic resuscitated. A democratic programme was issued, listing the rights of the nation and its citizens and urging protection of their welfare. All of this was illegal, according to His Majesty's government. The government that Connolly had said has no right in Ireland, never had any right in Ireland, and never can have any right in Ireland. The British government trampled on the rights and the expressed wishes of the Irish people, sent in the black and tans. In 1920, a British law partitioned Ireland, and the British government sought to restrict the Irish nation's rights in the treaty. Partition was rejected by the people, when in the spring of 1921, they voted for Sinn Féin, again as a unit. Yet again, the British government showed contempt for democracy when it encouraged a Stockholm Syndrome suffering minority misguided by sectarianism to bully the nation and divide Ireland. The treaty tried to legitimise the Unionist veto on Irish national aspirations, and for that reason alone, it should not have been signed. As well as partition, the treaty blatantly insulted the Irish people by obliging their elected representatives to take an oath of fealty to the British monarch, an office representing centuries of repression, persecution, land grabbing and occupation. To sign up for that would be to surrender any sense of self-respect or sense of duty to the people you are representing. To have signed up to that would prove yourself as being unfit to represent a people who had voted for a republic twice, 1918 and 1921. Your loyalty would not be to them, but to a foreign imperialist who believes God made him king. Not only king of his country, but king of ours. Incredibly, Article 5 meant that the Irish people would be liable for Britain's war debt, a debt accumulated by that country's bloodlust and profit drive. In effect, the Irish people were being obliged to pay for the cost of their own suppression, as well as the suppression of other countries occupied within the British Empire, and beyond that again. Additionally, land annuity payments by Irish tenant farmers to British landlords were part of the terms. Poverty-stricken people were forced to pay the richest of the rich for owning small plots of land that had been confiscated in British plantations. And the proposition wanted to tell us that this treaty, it didn't really matter whether it was a republic or a free state. It had no impact on people's ordinary lives. But if you're a tenant farmer in the west of Ireland and the British government are making you pay money for land annuities, it's going to have a very big effect on your life. It was almost as if Ireland had dominated England for 700 years, not the other way round. Would you have signed up to become Britain's rent collector in Ireland? Ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear a lot of defeatist talk about the IRA not being able to win a renewed war and the treaty being the best deal possible. Just remember that from 1969 to 1997, the IRA made it impossible for the British government to govern the north of Ireland at a time when the discrepancy in technological capabilities between the two sides was even greater than in the 1920s. There's nothing to say a sustained guerrilla war campaign would have sapped the British government and the British people's willingness to stay in Ireland. And on that point, I'll finish with a quote from Pierce. No treaty which abnegates a nation's nationhood is binding on that nation any more than a contract of perpetual slavery is binding on an individual. I beg to oppose. Gurmila Mahagus.
Proposition, Mr. Derek Keenan, who is our first speaker at Bill Speaks 2015.
Ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen. On the 7th of January 1922, the TDs of the Dáil, two of them, James Crowley from Kerry and Seamus Dwyer from Dublin, were faced with a choice. Whether they'd ratify the treaty that we have before us. What I want to do is I want to explore what might have been going through their minds when they had to make that choice. First, though, I want to pick up on something that was said by First Thought. He talked about how the poorest people in Ireland are going to have to pay annuities. They're going to have to pay rent to the British government, that we're becoming the rent bulls, effectively, of the British government. I'd like to fundamentally say to him, well, I wonder how much those people would appreciate their houses being burnt down, their families being shot, their people being murdered, and then being imprisoned and possibly tortured. I think that will actually be fun, and that those people would much prefer having to pay a small bit of rent that will very easily be taken down in the future because of the terms that are outlined in this treaty. What I want to talk about is I want to make perfectly clear to the opposition what the alternative to these treaties are. It is war. It is a full-scale British invasion. We can see this to be true. In the British government, there was huge support for the Ulster Unionists. There was also the fact that this was Ireland breaking on the empire. We were losing all public support in Britain if we broke for this reason. What this means is like we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we getting in return from the republic that opposition seem to want? We're getting 5 to 10 to 15 years of more executions, of more attacks, of more burnings for something that isn't included in this deal, and we might not get in the future. The opposition seem to believe that we're going to get this republic if we go to war, when in fact it actually limits our ability to get that republic. And is that justified, ladies and gentlemen? We absolutely don't think so. Because we have to ask ourselves, if there is a conflict like this, who is going to die? Is it going to be the Republicans like on the opposition? Sure, men like Rory O'Connor can absolutely decide to march up to the forecourts with a gun and oppose the treaty. I'm not sure how successful he would have been on his own, something he's allowed to do. But he's not allowed to choose for the innocent civilians of Ireland who he's going to bring this violence upon, because he's not the one who controls their destiny, as First Up seemed to be addicted with. Furthermore, we don't even know what the Ireland is that we want to fight for. He continually mentioned this republic, this free nation, and this freedom that we're going to have. But he never defined what that freedom's going to look like. Is it going to look like what William Butler Yeats wanted? An ancient mythological Ireland that embraced its Celticness? Is it going to be like Patrick Pearse envisioned, a Catholic Ireland dominated by the Catholic Church? Is it going to be a situation where it's purely the Archbishop has a veto rather than the King has a veto? Surely maybe it shouldn't be a situation where we fear the King, we should fear men like John Charles McQueen. Is money going to hold power in this state? We know where the elite stood during the 1930 knockout, and it certainly wasn't with the workers. Is this state going to be like Connolly and Larkin envisioned? A state where workers have it's a workers' state effectively, and Esperanto is the national language. Is that the kind of republic we want? And if we went to the Dáil, the 121 members of the Dáil, and we asked them, what kind of republic do you want to get? We would get 121 different answers. And if we don't know what that Ireland is, if we don't know the state and the republic that we're striving for, how can we justify fighting for that? And now, I want to show you how the treaty actually allows us to decide what our state is, because it lets us look at who we are first, and then to decide whether fighting for that republic is justified. And the treaty allows that, I'll take you in a moment, because it gives us the power to decide who we are.
I think you'll find the republic was envisaged in the proclamation and also in the democratic programme of the first Dáil, which was elected by the Irish people to set itself up as a republic.
Well, it was envisioned as, see, you've said that word republic like twice in your point of information now, but you just said that it's going to be a republic. You didn't tell us what the setup's going to be in that republic, what kind of republic we're going to have, what kind of state we're going to strive for. And until you can answer that question, if it's just this notional idea of a republic that you're fighting for, I've already pointed out why that isn't justified, because you're bringing an awful lot of violence down on the innocent civilians of Ireland. So previously, before this treaty, the decisions were purely made in London, in Westminster. They were the ones deciding everything for our country. They already have a British identity. They have an identity which they're going to be imposing on the country. What happens now, what happens with this treaty, is that the Free State government has complete control over their domestic issues, to the same extent as we see in Australia and Canada. And if our status is the same, there's no reason to believe that the British would interfere in that decision-making process, because why would they? They've been trying to solve the Irish question for a generation now. There's no reason for them to intervene. Furthermore, the treaty actually recognised the sovereignty of Ireland. It recognises Ireland as a separate state from Britain with pure control over their domestic issues. And when that is the case, it's much more difficult for the British then to say, we're going to march in and stop them making the decisions because they're simply an underling of our country. What this means as well, furthermore from this treaty, that when these decisions are being made from Dublin, we can now focus on providing the basics for our people, the food, the education, those things that you need to survive. And that allows the state to function. And when you combine those two things, the sovereignty of the country, the control over domestic issues, and the provision of the basics that people need to lead, that the power is in Dublin, the people feel like they control the state. They can figure out the state that they want because they no longer have to worry about an outside force marching in and telling them that they can't decide the fate of their own country. And if, ladies and gentlemen, we then decide, after coming up with what state we actually want, that can only be achieved through violence, that is justified. So be it. But if we don't sign this treaty, we're removing any potential for a peaceful conclusion to this, because we're effectively saying that, like, you've given us this massive opportunity to reach peace. You've given us this ability to control our destiny, but we don't want it because we want to violently take back the state that you already envisioned. We're taking away our ability to decide our own fate. We're taking away our ability to control our own matters. Ladies and gentlemen, to finish off, what this treaty allows us is it allows us to decide our own fate. We're no longer controlled by an oppressive force, whether that be Britain or whether that be the threat of war. This allows us to build the state that we want. And it is for those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, that I beg you to propose.
Very, very impressive speech, and then call on our first guest of the evening, Mr. Martin Mansfield.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Phil for their invitation. And it brought back to mind the first time I participated in a debate of this society in 1987, marking the 50th anniversary of the Irish Constitution with the late Michael O'Leary, former Labour Party leader. It is generally accepted by historians that this state derives from the treaty. So assuming we value our independence, why should we not have signed it? Moreover, unlike tonight, the atmosphere at the time was very tense and highly charged, and the Irish delegates, who had huge responsibility, were under immense and conflicting pressures, so no one today can say with certainty what they might have done if they had been in Hant's Place, Sir John Lavery's studio, and the equivalent of what we would today call the Irish delegation room, or Downing Street that night. To my mind, there are 5 reasons why the Irish delegates should not have signed the treaty on the 6th of December 1921. The first is that they had promised their cabinet colleagues only a couple of days previously not to do so without further reference back. The second is that by signing the treaty, they allowed the British to split the independence movement, having already split the island. The third reason was that immediate signature was being demanded under threat of immediate and terrible war, and treaties signed under duress are, strictly speaking, invalid in international law. The fourth reason is that the status of the Irish Free State, to come into being exactly 1 year later, was not based on democratic principles of consent or self-determination, but on imperial concession described euphemistically on the British side as Dominion Home Rule. The fifth and most important reason was that the treaty put forward a sham unity demanded on the Irish side, coupled with a deceptive device, the Boundary Commission, which led not only to long and difficult decades of Anglo-Irish relations, but to conflict in Northern Ireland after discriminatory and permanent one-party majority rule, which is not democracy, was eventually challenged on the streets by the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. I will now elaborate a little on each of those reasons. No ministers or negotiating team in virtually any country today would dream of signing a major treaty in opposition to the known wishes of their leader, or going outside an agreed cabinet position without first consulting back. The telephone existed in 1921, but was not used. Now, I noted that in an Irish Times report of the 6th of March 2015, that Finance Minister Michael Noonan, reflecting on the Eurozone finance ministers' travails with their Greek colleague, quipped that, and I quote, "If Michael Collins had a mobile phone, we would still be under the British," implying he was right to cut the knot. Lloyd George was a brilliant and theatrical negotiator. If Griffith and Collins, neither of whom were subtle negotiators, felt the treaty had to be signed, they should have come home and made that case, even if that meant a political crisis, and if necessary, brought back De Valera with them to London. One can understand the view that people did not want a resumption of the war and that Ireland was militarily vulnerable, but the delegation should not have acted unilaterally. The reality rarely commented upon is that the treaty brought to a head an increasingly bitter internal political power struggle and saw De Valera ousted within the month by Griffith and Collins. A proof that it wasn't purely ideological was the stance of De Valera's critic in America, the old Fenian John Devoy. He denounced the treaty at first because he thought it had De Valera's support, but reversed position and supported it when he learned that De Valera was opposed to it. The only people to feel a sense of triumph over the treaty were Lloyd George and his friends. He had split the independence movement, and now the British could hand over to one side the task of bringing the other to heel as an enforcer, severely weakening a country that would become independent in the midst of civil war. In the first half of 1922, the ever-pugnacious Churchill, as colonial secretary, advised by the imperial ideologue Lionel Curtis, vetoed every compromise and pushed Collins and Griffith into taking on militarily their opponents, supplying the guns that bombarded the forecourts, including, by one account, a gunner. As Lloyd George laid out in a letter of the 13th of August 1921 to De Valera regarding the Irish claim that Britain should acknowledge the right of Ireland to secede from her allegiance to the King, and I quote, "No such right can ever be acknowledged by us," end of quote. And on the 7th of September, he referred to the principle of consent as the foundation of British constitutional development, but said he could not accept an interpretation of that principle which would commit them to any demands they should present, such as setting up a republic and repudiating the crown. As we know, De Valera, without much Republican support, was prepared to agree to what he called external association with the British Commonwealth. A generation later, beginning with India in April 1949, Britain dropped its opposition to republics within the Commonwealth just at the point that Ireland was headed for the exit. Lloyd George, who depended on the Tories to stay in office, had little room for manoeuvre on this, and it was an issue that would be sorted out over time. The Irish Free State was a dominion only in name, not in sentiment, with that status reduced to the bare minimum post-1932 before the passing of the External Relations Act of 1936. But I must quote to the proposition what Churchill wrote in 1941 when he was putting a lot of pressure on Ireland to give up its neutrality. Juridically speaking, we have never recognised Ireland as a sovereign independent state. That was his attitude even then. The worst failure of the treaty related to Northern Ireland, where it emphatically did not provide the freedom to achieve freedom. On unity, on which Redmond had been so strongly criticised, the delegation was looking for a fig leaf, a placebo, a face saver, or in the words of the diary of Tom Jones, Lloyd George's private secretary after a conversation with Griffith, and I quote, a conditional recognition of Irish unity, however shadowy, end of quote. Like Redmond before them, Sinn Féin let Fermanagh and Tyrone slip through their fingers, where there was a clear nationalist majority, for which, as Lloyd George put it privately, no one in Great Britain was prepared to die. While power would be transferred to a nominal 32-county Irish Free State, Northern Ireland would be allowed to opt out, as she did the following day. The Boundary Commission, which was only ever going to recommend very minor two-way adjustments, allowed the pro-treaty side to believe, or at any rate to claim, that large areas would be transferred, even making Northern Ireland unviable, while the British side privately assured Unionists that Northern Ireland would, for all practical purposes, stay as was. The biggest failure of first Redmondites and then Sinn Féin was that they did not make Unionists face up to the rigorous consequences of partition, which was that no county or city contiguous to the proposed six-county border, which had a clear nationalist majority, should be incorporated in the excluded area subsequently Northern Ireland. That would have left a lot of Unionists on the wrong side of the border, which would at least have given them pause for thought. None of this is to justify the series of mistakes made in 1922, both by civilians and military, by Free Staters and Republicans, and by the British government as a third party. A collective cabinet decision to accept or reject the treaty without being confronted with a fait accompli was required, and the delegates should have insisted on that, which would have left Lloyd George with no basis for carrying out his immediate threats. Thank you.
Mr. Alton.
Madam Chairman, before my time begins, I just want to draw attention to a great loss. Somebody who died today who was associated with this institution. I'm talking about Terry Pratchett, who sadly died today at the age of 66. Now you can start my time. Okay. I want to talk about two individuals briefly as well. And to begin, I suppose in the form of a family anecdote, the two individuals, one of you may have heard of, PJ Rutledge. He was a Fianna Fáil Minister for Agriculture under De Valera in the 1930s and 40s. The other you won't. His name was Justin McKenna. Both were members of the Second Dáil. Justin McKenna was my granduncle. The treaty vote took place in January 1922. It was an open roll call vote conducted in alphabetical order. When the roll call was approaching the letter M, and my granduncle, so family lore has it, was about to vote, he felt a pressure to his left. PJ Rutledge was his best friend, and he looked down, and this is what he saw. Now, he never knew whether what was the bulge in Rutledge's coat was a gun or was his finger. But Rutledge leaned over and quietly whispered in Justin McKenna's ear, "Kneel." And when the vote came round, to his credit, McKenna stood up and voted Tá. I make the point, I suppose, to illustrate the fact that even though it took great courage, and it did take great courage to oppose the treaty and to continue, or to essentially vote to continue the Anglo-Irish War, it also took a certain amount of courage to do the opposite and to say that enough was enough. Let me read from a very significant issue of the Freeman's Journal. Ireland's Day of Triumph was the banner headline. On the facing page, it was a prominent image of the Irish Parliament House on College Green, and the headline, "At last our own again," accompanied by drawings of Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, Daniel O'Connell, James Stevens, Isaac Butt, and Charles Stewart Parnell. And the Freeman's leading editorial that day observed that yesterday the Charter of Ireland's freedom was signed. The momentous event thus celebrated was not the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The Freeman's elation dates from the 19th of September 1914, the day after Home Rule received royal assent. Contrast that with the Freeman's coverage on the 7th of December 1921 of the conclusion of the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations. It's restrained, to put it mildly. The first sign of life is on page 3. There's a photograph of 4 members of the Irish delegation with the headshot of Collins inset under the headline, "The 5 men who fought the battle at Downing Street." Ominously missing from the shot is one Erskine Childers, secretary to the delegation. The lack of any editorial comment on the normal editorial page, page 4, might suggest that the news of the signing had come too late for the leader writer, except that on page 5, the journal carries the full text of the treaty. What comes across is a palpable sense of relief rather than elation. The page 5 headlines read, "Dublin's glad surprise. Citizens resigned to war, amazed by news. Story told in happy faces." Although immediately voided, temporarily at least, by the Suspensory Act and a global war, Home Rule, when finally achieved in September 1914, was greeted by moderate nationalists with immoderate rapture. In 1921, the conclusion of a deal in London, offering something more than had been achieved by Redmond, was greeted by a weary communal sigh. The country was exhausted. Persistence was futile. That exhaustion alone probably justifies the decision of the Dáil to accept the freedom to achieve freedom, as Collins memorably put it. The first principle of the gambler, and the Anglo-Irish War was a huge gamble, is know when to hold them, know when to fold them. I wish to footnote Willie Nelson for that reference. When Collins is telling you the game is up, the game is up. The treaty debate itself was essentially about accepting a once and for all offer, fait accompli. It wasn't about Dev's document number 2, the notion of external association, though a lot of time was spent discussing that formula. More time, I think this is quite interesting, far more time than was spent discussing the issue of partition. Michael Laffin has worked out that 5%, thereabouts, 5% of the treaty debate was spent on the issue, discussing the issue of partition. When you examine the treaty closely, you wonder, what was all the fuss about? Why did it have to be peace by ordeal? Why had a debilitating and vile war been an essential prerequisite to something that was not remarkably different from the rather disappointing and inadequate Home Rule Act of 1914? Asquith's template had legislated for a form of dual monarchy. So did the treaty. North East Ulster was, albeit temporarily, excluded from the operation of the 1914 Act. It was still excluded as Northern Ireland after the treaty. It remained as excluded as ever after the Civil War. Collins described it as his death warrant, but his fingerprints were all over it. In Article 3, Ireland would not be accommodating a Governor-General, but a, quote, representative of the Crown, appointed in like manner as the Governor-General of Canada. The oath to be taken by members of the new Irish Parliament swore allegiance first, quote, to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, unquote, and promised merely to be, and I quote here again, faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heirs and successors by law, which to me means that Kathleen Ní Houlihan agreed not to have an affair with any other king, or indeed any other queen. Semantics, perhaps, and circumlocutions, no doubt, not sufficiently persuasive to prevent the ultimate execution of Collins and the subsequent growth of his martyr myth. But was the freedom to achieve freedom not enough? It wasn't enough, obviously, to avoid the fratricide of the Civil War. Was the entire country so impatient for a republic that everything had to happen at once, a republic which ultimately happened by accident, pretty much. For some, that was clearly the case. A significant minority, if the result of the treaty debate is to be taken as a measure of Republican sentiment. But I wonder, if Eamon de Valera had been offered the, quote, articles of an agreement for a treaty between Great Britain and Ireland on Easter Sunday, 1916, would he have accepted them? Would Pádraig Pearse have issued the countermanding order himself, had what was available in 1921 been available in 1916? Probably not. We are talking about Pearse after all. Be in no doubt that had the Irish sacrificed this opportunity for an honourable peace, the country that had only recently defeated the Kaiser would have unleashed terrible war on the Irish, whose failure to accept what was dangled in front of them would have been all the justification required. The court of public opinion would have ruled in favour of Britain. And a couple more years, or perhaps more than a couple more years, of inadequately reported mutual atrocity on a scale far greater than the Civil War would have been guaranteed. And as we all know, Britain does atrocity far better than Ireland does. I urge you to support the motion.
He's a senior freshman student of law and political science and president of the FIL.
So I have loads of pages. Cool. Ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I come to you with a sort of different perspective on the opposition side of this debate. I don't identify as a Republican. I'm not a Fianna Fáil politician. In fact, I wouldn't vote for Fianna Fáil. I'd actually vote for Fine Gael. And as well, in my speech, I don't want to look at any sort of like political ideologies or beliefs, but actually at like the detrimental effect and outcome that the treaty brought, that was brought as a result of accepting the treaty and the terms of that. So yes, and as well, I come to you with as well as like a former member of like an orchestra called the this is a bit of a personal plug or something, as a member of like Cross Border Orchestra Ireland, which is actually a great thing. It was set up just after the Troubles, not just after the Troubles, but in 1990, when it was to bring together children from the North and the South, from community, like we'd be playing in an orchestra where like friends of mine, like their relatives bombed and they're going to be murdered by other children whose relatives might have come from very different backgrounds. It's like, and so this is what like the treaty brought this about as a result of like a partition and a result of accepting that, like the bloodshed and like the years of like sectarian violence for those left up north, like those that we abandoned, because the proposition come up here and tell you that we provided with like a great option for us. It's very, very easy for us to say down south that this was good for us, but we forget about those that we left behind. We forget about the people like the Catholics in like even in like Republican areas that were promised, as Eamon mentioned you, by the Boundary Commission, that they were going to be given, there was going to be the boundaries were going to be drawn to allow them to be in the south, and as this didn't happen, which I will also talk about in my speech. So as well, like Darragh comes up here and he tells us that we're providing for a free nation for all of those. We don't think so. We think that we're forgetting about a lot of people, and we think that like the negotiators should have gone back, or they should have stayed there and negotiated until they were given a state that represented the whole people of Ireland, those that want to be a part of it. So just in starting my main substantive in this in my speech, as well, you might think that like anyone on the opposition would say that like, or anyone like opposed to signing the treaty is some like disillusioned Republican who like basing their decision on some misplaced patriotism rather than misplaced patriotism, rather than like pragmatism and concern for the loss of life that would have happened as a result of like the war of independence. And we've heard this from like Amy mentioning it in her speech about like what would have happened if, say, we were to sign this treaty. But to that I say, like the loss of life, like in the Civil War that came about as a result of like a polarized political community, post-treaty, and like this fractious political environment that was sustained for such a long period of time, which can be evidenced by like the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins in 1927, 4 long years after the Civil War had ended. Okay, so I was going to talk to you as well, just about like the context under which the treaty was signed, which has been brought up by some members on our side of the House. And I like the signatures of the treaty. So what David Lloyd George did was he like presented the negotiators with 2 envelopes. One of them would announce like the recommencement of immediate and terrible war, like the War of Independence, and the other announced a deal that had been reached in negotiations. So like and then as well, on top of that, they were given like a time threat as related to time as to when they would have to like choose which option they're going to go for. Like we questioned the ability of the Irish negotiators to evaluate the terms of which the British demanded. Like rather than being able to do that, like they took the knee-jerk and the easy option. And like even I question, like given how effective war tactics of the Irish army had been to that point, like a question that like George would have had to recommence the war, unfairly detrimental to Ireland as a result of the Irish negotiators buying that threat, and like a referral back to De Valera was crucial to the dynamic of the negotiators. So like as well, we can look at like I feel like we can look at this debate in sort of like in hindsight, in retrospect, and look at like who we have failed as a result of accepting this treaty. Like the people that we left behind, as I mentioned at the start of my speech, people that we abandoned to live in years of violence. Like as I mentioned before, the boundary commission, it promised to transfer Catholic areas to the south of like nationalist majorities along these border zones, promising them that they would be transferred into the south in a few years. And of course, this didn't happen. The Commission recommended relatively small transfers and in both directions. Is this justice? We don't think so. We think that like the partition has allowed for like the troubles to go on, and we think they were an inevitable outcome of that. And like, what does this mean for like Catholics in Northern Ireland? Is that they face like years of discrimination. As David Trimble once said, the North has been a cold house for Catholics. Partition has meant that we've abandoned them to rule a vicious sectarian government. And there was a really similar discrimination in the South for Protestants. We think that like had the Catholics of the North, we don't think that the Catholics of the North had even given their consent to be marooned into this sectarian state. We think that the treaty was not a treaty for all the people of Ireland. It was a treaty for those, or it was not a treaty for those that wanted to be Ireland. By accepting the treaty, we're failing so many people left in the North. We're causing them years of harm. We're causing them years of bloodshed. We're causing them to set up like this orchestra to like bring people together when like this may not have been entirely necessary. We're causing like people to have lived in a turmoil and lived in tense state. So like, what have I brought to you like in my speech? I kind of talked about sheets in the ground. Talked about like the pragmatic, like taking like some more of a pragmatic approach to like who we failed as a result of signing this treaty. And I thank you for listening and beg you to oppose.
To arrange your sheets and so on that, I call on our final speaker from the proposition bench, Ms. Izzy Sweeney, who is a junior freshman Irish studies student.
Okay, so being an Irish studies student, I often think about the way in which our country works and the way we are the way we are, like in terms of politically and like sociologically as well. Like the single defining event in our history is the signing of the treaty that day in 1921. I wholeheartedly agree with the decision our delegates made and believe that I or anyone else in the room would have probably done the exact same thing. We have to look at the information they had. We have to look at all that they had available to them, and we have to look at all that they believed to be so true and all that they had been put through, right? I find it incredibly insulting for opposition to come up here and talk about events like in hindsight or retrospectively, because I feel that doesn't do fair justice to the delegates that made that decision that day, to the people who died for that cause. It's not fair to do that. They didn't know all the bloodshed that was going to come about, right? I don't think it's very fair, right? And I also think it's unfair for them to peg it as either treaty or the freedom as well. Like, I think the freedom exists in a way that we need, like, all of our other resources in our country to be peaceful and our country to exist in such a way that freedom can be utilized in the same way. I think the treaty was the best option. No, thank you. The treaty was the best option that we had at the time. The treaty gave us the best option that we had ever had since like the occupation and like the control the British had over our country. Like, I think it is incredibly not selfish, I think it's incredibly ignorant and like horrible for us as the youth of the country to like mock our like founding fathers and like the wise decisions they made that day. I'm going to be very patriotic and very nationalist. Okay, so like the years leading up to the signing of the treaty were hard, violent years across the country. Our country had not been peaceful and had not been solely ours for many years, dating back to the plantations. The infiltration of British culture and the divide between who is traditionally Irish and who is traditionally British changed our landscape, like not just geographically, but in terms of like how we interacted with each other, like social divisions. Like the War of Independence, spurred on by the failed rebellion of 1916, was one of the worst and violent wars the country had seen in its time. Like, fighting became dirty and more personal. Rebellions were no longer isolated incidents that took place in small areas. Warfare was everywhere in a way that the country had not seen in living memory, at least. The IRA was made up of brothers, fathers, uncles, neighbours. Local houses were used in the battle for hiding. There was no escape from the war. The stories of bloodshed were personal. They were in people's front gardens, unlike the country had ever experienced. We can all agree that independence was something to fight for, that the beliefs and ideals of those leading the fight were good and important, but the bloodshed, the death, and the nature of the war was not something our leaders could support or continue anymore. The people were tired and losing momentum. The IRA was in fact running out of resources. Like, regardless of what the first speaker on proposition says about the IRA's ability in the 1960s, Michael Collins knew the best that the IRA could not continue anymore. Like, they knew that they could not support this war anymore. The truce that was called was necessary, and more importantly, like, the events after the truce had to do something. They had to signify something. Something good had to come from all the devastation that the country had faced during the War of Independence. The treaty was the best they could have gotten. The British didn't want to surrender. The British didn't want to relinquish power, and they didn't want to relinquish the stronghold they had over our country, and they most certainly did not want to lose face. We did not send our strongest delegation. We did not have all the resources that our opponents had. And perhaps if we had held out, and perhaps if we had not signed, then we may or may not have gotten more concessions. But all that our delegates knew, and all that we could know, was that that there had been war. We would have not have gotten the 6 counties. We would have not received the Republic title as opposition tried to make out that we would have. They were determined to remain in control in any way they could have. They were determined to keep Ireland under the watchful eye, and I think that we cannot argue about the ifs and the buts. At the time, I'll take you down 1 minute. At the time, what was mostly needed was peace. What the country desperately needed was some sign that everything that the men of 1916 had died for was something that could lead to something good. Matthew.
How do we know what we could have gotten if the only way we could have done that is if we had said no to the treaty and renegotiated and taken more steps and not just accepted the first thing that they gave to us?
Okay, first of all, the negotiations took 2 months. I think that the delegates knew, and I think the treaty that was signed was more or less what they were willing to offer up. Second of all, I think it's pretty definite that the British wouldn't have just given us back the land, given that it was already separate from us. I think the British are quite good at keeping on to things, right? Sorry, where was I? Okay, the treaty gave us more independence than we had in years. It meant that finally, with some sense of our own country belonging to us, that we could control something. Even if it meant an oath of allegiance to the king, even if it meant that we would lose some of our land, the details of the treaty were murky. Matthew talked a lot about the boundary commission and what that meant. First of all, the logistics weren't definite. I think that is probably a failing of the treaty, but I think that our delegates, in all good faith, if they had known that decades afterwards that there had been so much bloodshed and so much violence, then they would not have done that. Like I genuinely believe that they had every good faith in the treaty that we had, right? Like we must consider the conditions in which the treaty was negotiated. Like as I've already said, after 2 months of toing and froing, the progress had been minimal and the messages from home were contradictory and confusing. The delegates were divided in themselves. The nation was resting solely on their shoulders in a foreign country. Like not only the citizens of the time, but also the citizens who had died for our independence and all the deaths that they would have foreseen if this immediate and terrible war had come about. The fear of them not delivering something, like the fear that the war would start again this time, so they did not have the means to fight it off, like they didn't have the means to put up a decent fight against the RIC. I think that means that they are allowed, there had to be a signature. They were told that the war would rear soon. They were acting in good faith and in the best interest of our country because all they knew was that there had been enough bloodshed already. They did not know the outrage that would follow. They did not know that a massive civil war shaping our political system forever would erupt. They just knew that their friends had died, that their neighbour's family had been ripped apart from the casualties occurring in the War of Independence. They knew only the fact that our country was hurting anyway, that the people were dripped in sorrow anyway, and something had to change, and they could not allow this violence and suffering to continue anymore. We cannot speak perfectly on what any one of us would have done in any given period. We weren't there. We don't know what it was truly like to wake up every day and know that your country was at war and know that you were the military operative behind said war. We do not know, but we do know that our country had suffered enough. We know that this is the best deal that we could have gotten and that the delegates that were sent did the best they could. We should only have the utmost respect for their courageous and right decisions. They gave our country what they deemed to be peace, and they deemed peace to be more important than to what they seemed to be to them, the impossible ideals of those who weren't actually present. Like Michael Collins' quoted famously saying, "Early this morning I signed my death warrant." I'm very glad he did, and the treaty should have been signed, and I'm very glad for the country that we live in today because of the treaty. I beg you to propose.
I must thank the Phil for inviting me here. I suspect it will be for the last time. This is a very serious business that we're debating, and it obviously has resonances for the future and the present as much as for the past. I'm going to address the issues really in 2 ways. One is apropos of the treaty negotiations and would this House have signed the draft treaty on that night, and then in some ways the separate and more complicated issue of whether the Dáil should have accepted the treaty by a narrow margin in January 1922. And it's interesting in that regard to show the hazards of it. What I think you mentioned James Dwyer, in January 22, who voted for the treaty. Well, I think it was November that year he was shot dead in his shop in Rathmines. So there were consequences for individuals. They may not have realised it for the positions that they took. In the treaty debates, it comes as no surprise, perhaps a somewhat confused speech was made against the treaty, but with a very clear ending: "We cannot go into the Empire," by P.J. Maloney, TD from Tipperary, who in fact was my great-grandfather. And in some ways I share his confusion, though not obviously the agonies that he went through when his son was killed in 1921, his business was burnt down in 1920, his other 2 sons were under sentence of death. But the difficulties that faced, and if you read the treaty debates and so on, you'll see this, the difficulties faced by TDs in January 22 in saying, do we or do we not take this, were thrust upon them by the perhaps honest but disastrous decision taken by the Irish delegation, in a sense at the point of a gun, from David Lloyd George's gun on the 6th of December 1921 to sign the draft treaty as in its final form. And I think even Martin obviously was engaged in very many negotiations over many years on behalf of the Irish state. Will know this better than the rest of us, but negotiations of such importance are a matter not simply of procedure and of inching forward, but of knowing what your bottom line is and knowing what your rules of engagement are and knowing what your commitments are. And it's perfectly clear, notwithstanding the threat of immediate and terrible war, that kind of phrase that was used. Notwithstanding that the letter, I think this is important. You mentioned, I think, the two envelopes, which were both letters. They were both addressed to James Craig, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. And it seems to me the threat of immediate and terrible war that hung over those discussions was much more likely in the short term to be not in what effectively the British had already given up, which is the 26 counties, but in Northern Ireland. And the people would have felt that an immediate and terrible war, I'm pretty sure, would have been the nationalist minority, particularly in Belfast, who had already in 1920 been subjected to very considerable violence, to some extent in response to Republican violence, and who in 1922 again were to get a hammering while the Free State was busy with its civil war. My grandfather on the other side, an IRA officer in County Down, was violently opposed to the treaty. In the end, he came south, writes to a friend in internment in the north, as it happens. Well, I think the treaty is the best we could do, even though it meant he was out of the north forever. But what else could we do? And he also says, look at document number 2. Look at De Valera's proposal during the treaty debates, which was itself an abandonment, if you like, of the purest argument of a 32-county republic. So in some ways, I'm adding to the confusion rather than the contrary. But I think there were plainly mistakes made in good faith in the months and the weeks leading up to that final crucial meeting in number 10 Downing Street. I think that there was an opportunity there, notwithstanding that the threat was there. But Lloyd George was a politician. You know, the threats are at a point in negotiation are what you do, right? Grandstanding is what you do. I don't know if there are any Greeks here. You know, this is politics. This is what you do. But I think the brilliance of the British negotiation and so on wasn't simply in using weasel words. It wasn't simply in, for example, in twisting, if you like, the language apropos of the Boundary Commission by inserting that fatal little extra clause. But it's also about how you manage the opposition, and they managed the opposition brilliantly. It's clear that the Irish delegation was worn out, that they were to some extent split. They were away from home. They were under a lot of pressure on all sides, and to some extent they buckled under that pressure. And I think that is so. My advice would have then to be, how am I doing on time, Chair?
5 minutes in.
All right, okay. My advice, had I been there, I would not have signed that treaty as it stood. I would have argued we must go back, even if I loved it. We first have to check it with our principles. That was the deal, and so on. I think that's clear. But the second thing is, the reason I wouldn't have signed the treaty is that whatever the outcome of the Boundary Commission was admitting the possibility, not simply of a redivision of Ireland, the Ireland created by the Government of Ireland Act, but also of the exclusion of part of Ireland. I mean, that's what it meant, no matter what you say. I would have been arguing for protections in the new Ireland and protections in the new Northern Ireland for minorities. And it is I think, greatly to the credit of Irish political culture, and notwithstanding that we spend most of our time, particularly in British media, being told how priest-ridden and how backward independent Ireland was, or perhaps still is. But if you contrast the way when the two Irelands were created, in this jurisdiction, in the midst of civil war, institutions were created, the Dáil and the Seanad, including 24 of the first 60 senators are non-Catholic, right? There's women are included, which at the time was progressive. There's a conscious effort. The man who commanded the British Army here from 1916 to 1918, Sir Brian Mahon, he's put in the first Senate. So there is an effort, consciously, structurally, to engage with the minority, who in a sense, the Protestants and Southern Unionist minority who are here. And look at the contrast with Northern Ireland. My granny's brother, Dan Rice, was in the National Army here as a Northern IRA man, as part of the Northern campaign that never happened. He goes back up in January 23, back to the farm, says to the local RUC, look, I'm out of it, I just want to farm. He for his troubles, he's locked up till December 1924 when he emigrated, right? And that was the fate of Northern nationalists, particularly Northern activists in the new Ireland. I think that the treaty negotiations, had they given some thought, not to how they would reduce with the Boundary Commission, reduce the dreaded Northern Ireland to a smaller and perhaps sort of ideally to an unworkably small rump. But had they given more thought to the issue of minorities, which at the time was the central part of discourse in what became the League of Nations. I don't know, we forget the League of Nations now, but a huge amount of what the League of Nations did was to promote conventions precisely in multi-ethnic societies in the new states of the post-Versailles era, which had emerged, but to promote ways of protecting minorities, because by protecting minorities in new states, they may hold together. If you don't protect the minorities, look at whatever part of Ukraine Mr. Putin has left, you see what happens. So overall, Chairman, I feel that the disaster, in some ways, that the treaty was, is a disaster that could have been avoided. Not, I think, by the time, sadly, that the treaty debates came to a conclusion in January 1922, because by then the die was cast. And it must be with great difficulty that deputies made up their mind, because they didn't know what was going to happen. I do think the disaster really took place in number 10 Downing Street. And I think ultimately the inability of the Irish delegation to realise that we're being pressurised, we're being forced to do something which we shouldn't have to do. We're being kept away from Dublin. Why are they doing this? Is there really no alternative? Is immediate and terrible? What does immediate and terrible war mean? And above all, how could the British, for the sake of a delegation saying we have to go back to Dublin, not to say we reject this document, but we need to bring it back to our people, how could possibly have the British have gone back to war in Ireland in terms of international opinion and so on? It just wouldn't have been workable, wouldn't have been possible. And I think the calculation, had there been any, and had they not been so exhausted, had they not been so worn down, and had they not been so shocked by Lloyd George's disclosure that Griffith had given him an undertaking relating to Ulster, a rather ambiguous one, but he had given him a private undertaking not to break on Ulster, I think they would think the outcome could have been very different. But what you would not have got is a 32-county republic. Either a highly democratic, progressive 32-county republic, or the kind of 32-county republic which the sort of green proto-fascists of Sinn Féin currently are trying to work us towards. That's not to disagree with any of my colleagues, of course. So I think I should really end there just by saying, when you go into negotiation, and I've never been much good at negotiation, but to go into negotiation, particularly as a team, you must know what your bottom line is, and you must have a way by which you aren't forced at the moment to buy that carpet from the sort of Turkish carpet seller that is David Lloyd George, that you know straight away as soon as you get home is not what you want or whatever. So, but it would be with difficulty. It must have been enormous difficulties that those men faced, and enormous pressures. I think to damn anybody, either for accepting the treaty or for rejecting it, it may make for good politics. It may make for not for good films, for terrible films, like the Michael Collins film. But it devalues in a way the fantastic pressures and terrors and so on. Sorry, Chairman. The fantastic pressures under which people were under. And so I don't think we should blame those who took those decisions, even though we may regret them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So a general thank you to all of our speakers for what was a very fantastic debate tonight, especially our guest, Professor Hall, Mr. Mansur, pardon me, and Mr. Dunn. It's a big round of applause for all of our guests. Motion to the floor. So all those who are in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. And all those who are against the motion, please say nay.
Nay.
guys might just have the motion stands. So just a few other announcements before you go inside for our reception. So next week is our pro-sec debate on the motion that this house would go nude. Secondly, I would remind you to fill in your hours to return sheet. It's about nudes and just in case you need a bit of context. So I would remind you to fill in your hours to return, which are on your seats. I would also draw your attention to the fact that we have another guest next Friday, Simon Amstel, who will be speaking here in the chamber at 2 p.m. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I would also like to say a huge thank you to Wilder and Ahern and to DU History for being our best and favourite debate partners of the year, and we really appreciate the support that yourselves and the History Department have given. So much Thank you.